I stood on my porch, savoring the bitter warmth of my morning coffee, when Karen, the HOA president, stormed up my driveway like a drill sergeant on a mission. She was in her late 50s, her manicured finger jabbing toward my modest vegetable garden as if it were a felony in progress. "Step away from the illegal farm, sir, the cops are on their way," she barked, her voice cutting through the soft clucking of my 6 chickens, who remained blissfully unperturbed. I raised an eyebrow, taking a deliberate sip, and asked, "Illegal farm?" She huffed, clutching her clipboard like a sacred relic, and launched into a tirade about how this was a residential neighborhood, not some backwoods livestock operation, citing HOA rules against unsightly farming. My tomato patch and handful of hens were, in her eyes, a blight on the community's pristine image. She flipped through her clipboard dramatically, listing violations, unauthorized livestock, unapproved gardening, and an unregistered shed, pointing at the weathered tool shed that had likely stood since the house was built decades ago. Leaning against the porch railing, I suppressed a smirk and said, "Karen, it's a tomato patch and 6 chickens." Her eyes narrowed as she insisted I dismantle it all or face a report, her tone dripping with condescension ever since she'd introduced herself the day I moved in. I gave her my best polite smile, the one I'd perfected dealing with drunkards resisting arrest, and replied, "I appreciate your concern, but I own this property and I'm within my rights." She stomped off, already dialing her phone, muttering, "We'll see about that." I watched her retreat, almost feeling sorry for her, almost. She had no clue she'd just called the cops on the county sheriff. I'd moved here for peace after 20 years in law enforcement, escaping the chaos of criminals and paperwork for a quiet house with land for a garden and chickens. It was supposed to be my sanctuary, but then I met Karen. Within my first week, I'd seen her fine a neighbor for trash cans left out 5 minutes late and another for grass slightly too long. She ruled this place like a dictator with a vendetta, handing out violations like candy. Now she'd set her sights on me, and I could tell she'd underestimated her opponent. Not 10 minutes after she vanished, sirens wailed in the distance, and a squad car rolled up. 2 officers stepped out, scanning the scene, while Karen emerged from her house, arms crossed, smug as ever, declaring, "That's him running an illegal farming operation." Officer Daniels blinked, then waved at me. Sheriff Hudson." Karen's frown deepened as Daniels explained, "Karen, this is Sheriff Jake Hudson. He's our boss." Her face turned a warning label red, stammering, "That can't be right. He's breaking rules." Johnson, the second officer, chuckled. "Ma'am, HOA rules don't override state laws." Karen sputtered, "That doesn't change anything. He's still violating HOA rules." I decided to have some fun, stepping forward with a grin. "Karen, I take every reported crime seriously. As sheriff, I'll launch a full investigation into this and maybe the HOA's operations, too. Misuse of funds, illegal fines, that sort of thing." Her smugness evaporated, replaced by a flicker of panic as she backpedaled. "That won't be necessary." I pulled out my notepad, grinning wider. "Oh, I think it will. HOA fraud's a real issue, and I've heard some interesting things about fines around here." She accused me of harassment, but I just smiled. "I'm just enforcing the law, Karen." She stormed off, slamming her door, and the officers laughed, warning me she'd try something else. I tossed back the rest of my coffee, muttering, "This is going to be fun." The battle had just begun. The next morning, I woke to find an official-looking letter taped to my front door. Its bold, urgent notice of violation screaming Karen's retaliation. It accused me of everything from unauthorized livestock to creating an unsightly environment that lowers neighborhood appeal, complete with a $500 fine payable to the HOA within 10 days. I chuckled, shaking my head at her bureaucratic warfare. She wasn't wasting time. Instead of retreating, I strolled over to her pristine yard, her porch adorned with symmetrical flower pots, and knocked. She swung the door open, her triumphant smirk faltering slightly as she saw me holding the letter. "I see you received your violation notice," she said, her tone thick with satisfaction. I waved the paper casually. "I did, nice piece of fiction, but I've got questions." She crossed her arms, insisting it was all by-the-book HOA enforcement, but I pointed to my garden. "Karen, it's a small patch and a few chickens. No rule bans personal gardens or backyard hens." She sniffed, tilting her chin. "Actually, I found an old clause from 1987 prohibiting livestock and agricultural activities." I grinned, fighting a laugh. "Karen, that was for cows and pigs, not a couple of hens and tomatoes." Her eyes flickered with irritation, but she doubled down. "That's not for you to decide." Stepping closer, I lowered my voice. "Actually, it is. As sheriff, I enforce property laws, and this smells like harassment." Her smugness wavered, but she rallied. "If you disagree, bring it to the HOA meeting." I leaned against her doorframe. "Oh, I will. Did some reading last night. County regs override HOA rules on property rights and your fines. No legal backing." Her smile twitched as I pulled out my notebook. "Talk to neighbors, too. You fine Mr. Thompson $400 for a wooden fence, the Johnsons $200 for Christmas lights up 2 days late, and Mrs. Parker, 80 years old, $300 for her mailbox color." Karen's expression hardened. "That's within my jurisdiction." I clicked my tongue. "Nope, issuing fines outside legal regs is fraud, a crime." For a split second, fear flashed in her eyes before defiance took over. "You can't prove anything," I smiled. "Oh, I think I can." She slammed the door in my face, and I chuckled, strolling back home. By noon, Deputy Daniels called, laughing so hard I could barely hear him. "Sheriff Karen filed a complaint with the county, says you're endangering the neighborhood with reckless farming." I whistled. "What's my crime now?" he wheezed. "She claims your chickens threaten public safety, a gateway to rural chaos." I laughed. "Let's play along, send a county compliance officer for an official inspection, document everything." Daniels whistled back. "You're setting her up big time." I grinned. "Just following the law." The next day, the compliance officer arrived, clipboard in hand, and Karen pounced, dragging him to my yard like she'd busted a crime ring. "See, chickens, unauthorized farming, total disregard for HOA standards." The officer scratched his head, eyeing my hens pecking peacefully. "Ma'am, these are just chickens." Her eye twitched. "He's violating rules." He flipped through his notes. "County allows up to 6 backyard hens and personal gardens, no zoning laws against it. HOA can't override that." Karen's mouth flapped like a fish out of water. "But the HOA," he cut her off. "County law trumps it. Sheriff Hudson's within his rights." Her body stiffened, gears turning for a new angle, then she pivoted to me with a saccharine smile. "Sheriff, maybe I was overzealous, a misunderstanding, let's work it out as neighbors." I nodded slowly. "Oh, we will. I'm bringing auditors to the next HOA meeting for transparency. You don't mind, right?" Her face paled. "That's not necessary." I clapped her shoulder, badge gleaming. "I insist. See you there." The game had shifted, and Karen knew it. The HOA meeting was set for 6:00 p.m., and by 5:30 the community clubhouse buzzed with more people than it had seen in years. Word of the showdown had spread like wildfire. Neighbors who'd never bothered with these gatherings now crammed in, eager to watch the sparks fly. The air crackled with tension as Karen sat at the head of the long table, her smug mask firmly in place, though her eyes betrayed a tightness she couldn't hide. She knew I was coming for her. I walked in with Deputy Daniels and the county compliance officer, each of us lugging folders stuffed with documents, evidence that would unravel her reign. Karen's gaze flicked to the files, then she cleared her throat, plastering on a syrupy smile. "Good evening, everyone," she chirped. "I'm glad to see such a turnout. We're here to address recent violations and keep our neighborhood pristine." Murmurs rippled through the crowd, but most eyes stayed on me, waiting. I took a seat across from her, dropping my files with a thud, and let her continue. I'd like to address a misunderstanding with one resident, she said, turning to me. Sheriff Hudson, I think we miscommunicated about HOA rules. I apologize for any inconvenience. Her smile didn't reach her eyes, and I let the silence stretch before leaning back. Is that right? She nodded eagerly. Yes, and I propose I cut her off, sliding a document across the table. Before you finish, Karen, explain these. She blinked at the papers. What's this? I kept my tone casual. The HOA's financial records or lack thereof. The room went silent, her hands gripping the table's edge as the compliance officer adjusted his glasses and spoke. At the sheriff's request, we audited 5 years of HOA transactions. It's concerning. Mrs. Parker, the elderly widow fined for her mailbox, leaned in, lips pursed. Concerning how? The officer continued. The HOA collected over $40,000 in fines in 3 years, but there's no record of how half was spent, nearly $20,000 unaccounted for. A gasp swept the room, and Karen's smugness vanished, her face freezing. I flipped to another page. That's not all. We found fines for violations not in the official charter, rules you invented, Karen. Angry murmurs erupted as Mr. Thompson, fined for his fence, shook his head. So you've been stealing from us. Karen forced a laugh. Let's not jump to conclusions. Every fine was lawful. Daniels grinned, barely containing himself. Karen, what about personal expenses on HOA funds? Multiple spa treatments ring a bell. Her mouth flapped uselessly. That's, I added, and 16 catered luncheons in a year, fancy for a group meant to maintain the neighborhood. The room exploded, shouts of outrage filled the air as homeowners turned on her. You fined me for a garden gnome while you got spa days, one yelled. Where? The playground money? Another demanded. Karen slammed her hands on the table, her composure crumbling. This is a witch hunt. Everything was for the community. I raised an eyebrow. Even the $500 for your anniversary dinner's private chef. Silence fell, her face turning a furious red. You can't do this. You don't have authority. I held up my badge. Actually, I do. Based on this, I'm recommending a full investigation into HOA fraud and embezzlement. Get a lawyer, Karen. She shot to her feet, chair screeching. You can't prove anything. The compliance officer slid another document forward. We can, and your presidency is terminated. Her breathing hitched, eyes darting for support, but the crowd glared back, fed up after years of her tyranny. She'd lost, and she knew it. Karen's unraveling was a sight to behold. Her breaths came fast and uneven as she scanned the clubhouse, searching for an ally among the neighbors she'd terrorized for years, but all she found were cold, contemptuous stares. The compliance officer's calm declaration of her terminated presidency hung in the air, and her carefully built facade shattered. This isn't over, she snapped, her voice trembling with rage as she locked eyes with me, her finger jabbing the air. You think you've won. You think you can waltz into my neighborhood and ruin everything. I folded my arms, unfazed. Karen, it was never your neighborhood. It belongs to the people here, and they're done with your nonsense. Her frustration boiled over into a sharp, guttural scream, and she shoved past the table, storming toward the exit. At the door, she spun back, pointing at me with a shaking hand. You haven't seen the last of me, Sheriff, I grinned. Oh, I'm counting on it. The door slammed, and silence blanketed the room. Then, like a dam breaking, someone clapped, slowly at first, then another joined, and within seconds the place erupted in cheers. Neighbors shook hands, hugged, laughed. Mrs. Parker dabbed a tear from her eye, muttering about finally painting her mailbox whatever color she damn well pleased. Daniels clapped me on the back, grinning. Well, Sheriff, looks like you've got a fan club. I chuckled, shaking my head. I didn't do anything special, just made sure the law was followed. He smirked. So you running for HOA president now? I scoffed. Not a chance. Mrs. Parker piped up from the crowd. Too late, we've nominated you. Laughter rolled through the room, and I rubbed my temples, sighing. Maybe I'd beaten Karen, but my quiet farm life was slipping further out of reach. The meeting dissolved into chatter, people plotting to undo years of petty rules, and I slipped out, craving the peace of my porch. Back home, I sank into my chair, coffee in hand, watching my chickens peck at the dusk-lit grass, blissfully unaware of the chaos they'd sparked. I'd come here to escape the grind of law enforcement, not to topple an HOA tyrant, but Karen had turned it into a battlefield. Her parting threat echoed in my mind, and I knew she wasn't done. People like her didn't slink away quietly. Sure enough, the next day brought a new surprise. A typed letter slid under my door, this time from Karen's lawyer, claiming I abused my authority to intimidate and defame her, demanding I retract my accusations or face a lawsuit. I laughed outright. Her desperation was almost comical. She overplayed her hand, and I had the evidence to bury her. I called Daniels. Karen's lawyered up, says I defamed her. He snorted. She's got no case. We've got the audits, witnesses, everything. I grinned. Good, let's push back harder. I filed an official report with the county, detailing the HOA's financial discrepancies and Karen's baseless fines, attaching the audit records and statements from neighbors. By afternoon, I got word the district attorney was reviewing it. Embezzlement charges were on the table. Karen's lawsuit threat didn't scare me. It just fueled the fire. I wasn't just defending my garden anymore. This was about justice for everyone she'd bullied. That evening, I heard tires crunch on gravel. Daniels pulled up, grinning. DA's fast-tracking the case. Karen's in deep. I nodded, sipping my coffee. She started this war, he laughed, and you're ending it. The chickens clucked softly, and I smiled. Peace might still be a ways off, but I was ready for whatever Karen threw next. She'd picked the wrong sheriff to mess with. The sun barely crested the horizon when I stepped onto my porch, coffee steaming in the crisp morning air, expecting another salvo from Karen. Her lawyer's letter still sat on my kitchen counter, a hollow threat I'd already countered with hard evidence. My chickens scratched at the dirt, oblivious to the storm brewing, and I couldn't help but envy their simplicity. I'd filed the report with the county yesterday, and Daniel's update about the DA fast-tracking the case had left me optimistic. Karen's empire of petty tyranny was crumbling, and she had no one to blame but herself. But peace wasn't in the cards yet. Mid-sip, I spotted a news van rolling down the street, followed by a car with a local station's logo. Karen had escalated to the court of public opinion. A reporter hopped out, microphone in hand, beelining for me as a cameraman trailed behind. Sheriff Hudson, we're here about the HOA dispute. Care to comment? I leaned against the railing, keeping my tone even. Not much to say. The HOA's finances are under review for potential fraud. County's handling it. The reporter, a young guy with too much gel in his hair, pressed. Karen claims you're abusing your authority to harass her. She says her chickens, your chickens, are a public safety hazard. I smirked. My chickens are a threat to her ego, maybe. As for harassment, I'm just enforcing the law, something she's dodged for years. He scribbled notes, then nodded toward Karen's house, where she stood on her lawn, gesturing wildly to another news crew. She's painting herself as the victim here. I shrugged. She can spin it however she wants. Facts don't care about her story. The reporter grinned, sensing a scoop, and hustled off to catch Karen mid-rant. I watched her wave her arms, likely spewing nonsense about rural chaos and sheriff tyranny, and shook my head. She was digging her own grave. By noon, the story hit local airwaves, clips of Karen teary-eyed, claiming I bullied her out of her rightful role, spliced with my calm rebuttal and shots of my hens pecking happily. Neighbors started calling, some laughing, others furious she dragged the neighborhood into her circus. Mrs. Parker rang me up, voice trembling with glee. She's on TV saying you're a dictator. Can you believe it? After all she's done? I chuckled. Let her talk. She's just making it easier for the DA. Sure enough, Daniels swung by that afternoon, grinning ear to ear. Sheriff, the DA's loving this, her public meltdowns adding motive to the embezzlement case. They're pulling bank records now. I nodded. She thinks she's winning hearts, she's just handing us rope. He laughed. You called it this is more fun than you planned, huh? I sighed, glancing at my garden. I just wanted tomatoes, man. The next day, Karen doubled down. A protest sign popped up in her yard. Stop sheriff tyranny, save our HOA. A handful of her loyalists, maybe 3 or 4, milled around, holding similar signs, but most neighbors drove by with honks of support for me. I walked over, badge visible, and Karen glared, clutching her sign like a shield. You can't silence me, sheriff. I smiled. Wouldn't dream of it, keep talking, Karen. It's helping the investigation. Her eyes narrowed, but her cronies shuffled awkwardly, sensing the tide turning. Back home, I got a call from the DA's office. They'd found withdrawals linked to Karen's personal accounts, thousands siphoned from HOA funds. We're prepping charges, the voice said. Fraud, embezzlement, the works. I grinned, watching my chickens roam. Karen's war was loud, but mine was quiet, and I was winning. She'd pushed too far, and now the law was closing in. The morning after Karen's makeshift protest, I sipped my coffee on the porch, watching the neighborhood settle into an uneasy calm. Her sign still stood in her yard, swaying in the breeze, but her handful of supporters had vanished, leaving her crusade looking more pitiful than defiant. The DA's call about her personal account withdrawals had lit a fire under the case, and I could feel the noose tightening. My chickens clucked contentedly, oblivious to the chaos they'd sparked, while I mulled over Karen's next move. She wasn't the type to bow out gracefully, not after her TV stunt and lawn tantrum. Sure enough, around noon, a sleek black sedan pulled up to her house, and out stepped a man in a sharp suit. Her lawyer, no doubt, ready to escalate her desperate counterattack. I smirked, setting my mug down. She was predictable, if nothing else. Daniels texted me a heads-up. Lawyers filing an injunction to block the HOA audit, claims it's retaliation. I replied, let him try, evidence is ironclad. By afternoon, the local news ran a follow-up. Karen's attorney, a slick-talking guy named Brenner, stood beside her on her pristine lawn, declaring the sheriff's actions an unconstitutional overreach and vowing to protect her rights. Karen nodded solemnly, playing the martyr, but her eyes darted nervously when the reporter asked about the missing HOA funds. Brenner jumped in. Those allegations are baseless. We'll prove it in court. I watched the clip on my phone, shaking my head. Baseless, sure, except for the bank statements, audits, and neighbor testimonies stacking up against her. The DA called shortly after, unfazed. Injunction's a long shot, judge'll see through it. We've got subpoenas for her financials now, she's toast. I grinned. She's flailing, keep the pressure on. He laughed. Oh, this is personal for her, but it's justice for us. That evening, the neighborhood buzzed again. Word spread that Karen's injunction hearing was set for tomorrow, and folks were picking sides. Most rallied behind me, tired of her reign, but a few diehards clung to her, muttering about tradition and order. Mr. Thompson stopped by, still fuming about his fence fine. She's saying you're rigging the system. Can she really stop this? I clapped his shoulder. Not a chance, law on our side, and her stunts are just noise. He nodded, relieved, and headed off. The next morning, I drove to the courthouse, badge polished, files in hand. Karen wanted a fight, and I'd give her one she couldn't win. The hearing room was packed, neighbors craning for a view as Karen sat with Brenner, whispering furiously. The judge, a no-nonsense woman with steel-gray hair, called order, and Brenner launched into his spiel, claiming I'd weaponized my position to silence a community leader. I stood when my turn came, voice steady. Your Honor, I'm enforcing county law. HOA audits revealed unaccounted funds and illegal fines backed by evidence. This isn't retaliation, it's accountability. I slid the audit summaries across, $20,000 missing, fake violations, spa trips on HOA dime. The judge skimmed them, eyebrow raised, then turned to Brenner. Counselor, you're alleging overreach, but these documents suggest fraud. Explain. Brenner stammered, "We dispute their validity. Mrs. Karen acted in good faith." The judge cut him off. "Good faith doesn't vanish thousands of dollars. Injunction denied, investigation proceeds." Karen's face crumpled, her lawyer whispering frantically as the gavel banged. Outside, neighbors cheered, Mrs. Parker hugging me with surprising strength. "She's done for," I smiled. "Not yet, but we're close." Karen glared from the steps, defeated but defiant. I knew she'd try one last gambit. She was too stubborn to quit, and I was too stubborn to let her. The courthouse victory still hummed in the air as I drove home, the judge's denial of Karen's injunction ringing like a bell. Her legal Hail Mary had crashed, and the investigation was free to steamroll ahead. My chickens greeted me with their usual clucking indifference, and I sank into my porch chair, coffee in hand, savoring the quiet before the inevitable next strike. Karen wasn't finished. Her glare on those steps told me she'd claw back somehow, even as the walls closed in. By evening, Daniels called, voice crackling with amusement. "Sheriff, you'll love this. Karen's hosting an emergency HOA meeting tonight at her place. Says it's to rally the community against you." I laughed. "Let her rally, she's got no power left." He snorted. "Yeah, but heads up, she's claiming you forged the audits. Desperate stuff." I grinned. "Good, let's crash it." Daniels paused, then chuckled. "You're evil, I'm in." We rolled up to Karen's house at dusk. Her yard was lit with string lights, a dozen or so neighbors milling around, some clutching her protest signs, others just curious. She stood on her porch, megaphone in hand mid-rant. "And this sheriff thinks he can falsify records to frame me. I've served this community faithfully." I stepped into the glow, badge glinting, and her voice faltered. "Evening, Karen. Mind if I join?" Her eyes narrowed, but she waved me up, smug. "Go ahead, tell your lies." I faced the crowd calm. "No lies, just facts. The audits are county verified, not forged. $20,000 missing, illegal fines. Karen's got no charter to back her rules, and the DA's got her bank records." A murmur rippled through. Her loyalists shifted uncomfortably. She snapped, "That's slander. You're a corrupt tyrant." I held up a hand. "Call it what you want. Subpoenas don't lie." A neighbor piped up, Mrs. Johnson, fined for her Christmas lights. "Karen, where'd my $200 go? Spa days." Laughter broke out, and Karen's face flushed. "This isn't a joke. I've kept this place perfect." I grinned. "Perfect for you, maybe. HOA funds paid for your anniversary, chef, not playgrounds." The crowd turned, voices rising, anger long bottled up, spilling over. Mr. Thompson yelled, "You fined me for my fence while you lived it up." Karen clutched her megaphone, shrill. "You're all ungrateful. This is a conspiracy." Daniels, leaning by the car, called out, "Conspiracy's a stretch, embezzlement's simpler." That broke her. She hurled the megaphone down, storming inside, slamming the door. The crowd lingered, buzzing, then drifted off, some nodding my way. Daniels smirked. "Think that's her last stand?" I shook my head. "Nah, she's too stubborn." Next morning, the DA called. Charges were filed. Fraud, embezzlement, misuse of funds with a court date set. Karen's house stayed quiet, blinds drawn, but I knew she was plotting. By afternoon, a process server dropped off her latest move, a defamation lawsuit against me personally, claiming I ruined her reputation with malicious falsehoods. I laughed, handing it to Daniels when he swung by. "She's suing me for telling the truth." He skimmed it, grinning. "This'll get tossed. Judge'll see it's retaliation." I nodded. "Still, let's bury her, get the DA to add witness tampering. She's been calling neighbors, pressuring them to back her." Daniels whistled. "You don't mess around." I shrugged. "She started it." Evening fell, and I sat with my chickens, the lawsuit on my table, another battle in a war I hadn't wanted but wouldn't lose. Karen's reign was over. She just didn't know it yet. The law was slow, but it was relentless, and so was I. The defamation lawsuit sat on my kitchen table like a final, feeble jab from Karen, a last gasp of defiance as the legal machinery ground her down. Morning light filtered through the blinds, and I sipped my coffee, watching my chickens peck at the dew-soaked grass, their calm a stark contrast to the storm I'd weathered. The DA's charges, fraud, embezzlement, misuse of funds, had her cornered, and Daniel's hunch was right. Her suit wouldn't stand a chance against the mountain of evidence. By noon, he called with an update, voice brimming with glee. Sheriff, her lawyers scrambling, tried to delay the criminal case, but the judge shut it down. And your lawsuit, DA says it's DOA, she's got no grounds. I grinned. Told you she's grasping at straws, he laughed. Oh, and neighbors reported her calls, begging them to testify for her. Witness tampering on the table now. I nodded. Good, nail her with it. That afternoon, I drove to the station, filing a countersuit, malicious prosecution to hit back at her defamation claim, attaching the audits, bank records, and neighbor statements. The clerk smirked as I handed it over. Corinne's keeping us busy, I shrugged. She picked the fight. By evening, the news hit. HOA president faces charges, sues sheriff in bizarre twist. The clip showed Corinne's house, shutters tight, no sign of her protest signs gone, her bravado spent. Neighbors gathered at Mrs. Parker, instead toasting with lemonade free of her shadow. She hobbled over, grinning. Sheriff, we're painting my mailbox purple tomorrow, join us? I chuckled. Wouldn't miss it. The community was healing, reclaiming what Corinne had stifled, and I felt a quiet pride. I'd come for peace, not a war, but I'd fought for them anyway. Weeks later, the courtroom was packed for Corinne's arraignment. She sat stiffly beside Brenner, eyes hollow, her smugness replaced by resignation as the judge read the charges. 5 counts, including tampering after the DA piled it on. She pleaded not guilty, voice thin, but the evidence loomed. $20,000 unaccounted for spa trips, fake fines, all laid bare. My countersuit hearing followed. Her defamation claim collapsed in minutes, the judge citing overwhelming proof of her misconduct. Brenner barely argued, and Corinne's glare burned into me as I left the stand. Outside, Daniels clapped my back. She's done, trial's a formality now. I nodded. Hope so, tired of her face, he grinned. Bet she's tired of yours. Back home, I got a call, HOA disbanded by vote, replaced with a loose neighborhood council. Mrs. Parker was president, promising no fines, just potlucks. Months passed, and Corinne's trial ended in a guilty verdict. 3 years probation, restitution for every dime she'd stolen, her name mud in the county. She moved away, house sold quietly, and the neighborhood breathed easier. I sat on my porch one crisp evening, coffee steaming, chickens roosting as the sun dipped low. The garden thrived, tomatoes red and plump, and peace finally settled in. Daniel swung by off-duty, beer in hand. You ever miss the fight? I shook my head. Not a bit, just wanted this. He laughed, raising his bottle. To the sheriff who took down the HOA dragon. I clinked my mug against it. To quiet. The battle was over, won not with sirens or cuffs, but with stubborn truth and a few clucking hens. Corinne had underestimated me, and the neighborhood had rallied. I'd fought for my patch of dirt and ended up freeing them all. Now, with the stars winking above, I leaned back, content. This was the life I'd come for, and damn if it didn't feel good.